concept of mind control, the concept of being able to make other people do what you want them to without any resistance, without any thought of their own, and without any repercussions, wherein you could just push a button or say a trigger word and their memory gets wiped, has been something that most of us have experienced in movies, like the Bond series, perhaps. But what's fascinating is that most of these movies got their ideas from something that actually happened. And who else but the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States of America to go above and beyond in the 50s and try something on actual human beings, actual citizens of their own nation, to try and figure out if they could literally create a walking, talking, feeling assassin with no control over his or her, I should say, own sentiments. Was it a success? Was it even worth looking into? Was all of the time, effort, funds worth it? Well, for those of you that have already caught on, for those that haven't, I would like to mention what we're talking about today, and that would be Project Bluebird, also known as Project Artichoke. Brief history? Sure thing. Wikipedia, for what it's worth. Now, here's the interesting point. Broadly speaking, a lot of people have heard about MK Ultra, a lot of people have heard about a bunch of other projects that the CIA has done over the years. And when you look into what Project Artichoke actually entailed, you then understand that it was the predecessor of MK Ultra, the one that everybody talks about, the one that everybody knows exists. So what exactly was Bluebird? Well, it officially arose on 20th of August 1951. Operated by, of course, none other than the CIA. Another fun point about all of this is the fact that they labeled the project as something that was more inclined towards mind control and to gather information, as opposed to any, well, mischievous undertakings that the CIA wanted to actually get into. But then where did it all go wrong? One might ask. Well, here is where things actually went insane, and I'm going to read this word by word verbatim. Project Artichoke was the Central Intelligence Agency's secret code name for carrying out in-house and overseas experiments. Take a minute and try and comprehend what that means. We are all aware of what Gitmo was. We are all aware that in Guantanamo there were experiments that were conducted that were hidden from the world. Experiments that technically were outside the jurisdiction of American law because they were not on United States territory. Can the same be applied to in-house experiments though? On their own citizens? Of course not. And yet, when you talk about overseas experiments, it opens a Pandora's box of where might these have been done. Of course, no one can walk up to the CIA and expect some transparency on that end. But then again, when you understand that this was not just hoopla from the thin air and they did not want psychics to come in and start manifesting stuff that they believed they saw, it was more in line to use psychoactive drugs like LSD. They went as far as to induce hypnosis, went as far as to conduct total isolation from any sort of psychological inputs. Now, the very first agents that were at the mercy of Project Artichoke were exposed to rather, well, one can say, names of drugs that you and I have possibly heard of. For example, cocaine, marijuana, heroin. And then comes peyote and mescaline. Now, what the hell is peyote? Those of you that know, but those of us that don't, it's a small spineless cactus which contains psychoactive alkaloids. particularly mescaline. So, mescaline on its own as an isolated addition, and then there was peyote, which is essentially a Spanish word derived from the peyote, meaning caterpillar cocoon. None of this matters. Turns out, LSD was the most promising drug for Project Artichoke at the time. And the subjects who left these projects, once they were exposed to these drugs in so called controlled manners, they were fogged with memories. They couldn't remember half the thing that they were experiencing at the point. They had amnesia, couldn't recall what they had gone through. They had vague memories, faulty memories, dodgy memories that they themselves could not trust. Putting them in this very weird predicament wherein you cannot look back at thoughts that you know are yours, and yet are in this constant battle with whether it was real or whether it was something that your brain managed to cook up. Also making you very susceptible to being influenced by people who know what they're doing, like trained professionals. But all of this was for what? Did they really just want to put a bunch of people on drugs and then leave them hanging? Leave them wondering what could be? No, not quite. Well, it was more in line with what they wanted to accomplish by making people susceptible to these psychoactive drugs, which was what? Well, it was all about whether they can use people's wills against them. So essentially, what started as trying to make people do things that they did not want to do quickly turned into, can you use someone's own self or own mind against them? And then came the year 1952, where, as we all know, I mean, for those of us that do know about Artichoke, was the fact that LSD was increasingly given to unknowing CIA agents who had no idea what they were doing, who had no idea they were affiliated in this program, more to the likes of them not being aware of the fact that now they were subjects, completely unsuspecting. A horror experience from one of the past victims dictated that they were exposed to LSD every single day for 77 days. Now, can you imagine not being in control of your mind for 77 days? Not knowing what you're thinking, not knowing why you're thinking what you're thinking, and then being stripped away from it. They say it takes a month to develop a habit. 21 days, if you do it every single day, you pick up a habit, right? 77 days of continuous exposure to a psychoactive substance that was chemical in nature and resulted in long lasting and intensive damage to victims who never truly got justice. Artichoke went one step ahead though. The research that came out of Artichoke was also towards weaponizing diseases. Now, given the last pandemic that we've all gone through, weaponizing of diseases is a subject that a lot of us have a lot to say about. And yet, where did it all begin? Some say with Artichoke, some say even beyond. Well, when it came to Artichoke, it was about dengue fever. And a declassified Project Artichoke memo read that not all viruses have to be lethal. The objective includes those that act as short-term and long-term incapacitating agents. Now, I know what most gamers at this point are thinking. Where have I seen this before? And we've seen this in the game Hitman. I remember it vividly, but yeah, we used to have injections, as they would say. And you could inject guards to leave them incapacitated when you had a mission directorate of not permanently eliminating someone. Looking back at it, why was this a thing that was done in reality? And when you actually go on to understand that there has been a lot more worse things in the world, given, well, World War II and the things that happened there, the whole array of CIA projects that have occurred, global offsites, black sites, the Russian projects that not a lot of people know about. What about what North Korea is up to? What about what Japan did back in the day? There are a lot of question marks, there are a lot of evils that have existed, evidence of which have been covered up on multiple occasions, but to what extent is still up for grabs. Well, when the entire project was given the green light, the CIA had like an internal dispute over who was the person who was supposed to lead this program. And it was decided that a research staff, former United States Army Brigadier General Paul Gaynor, would oversee it. Who was Paul Gaynor, you might ask? Well, briefly, he was the man behind MK Ultra. He was the man behind Artichoke, and yet he is also the man who has received several distinguished Service Cross medals of the United States Army. Make of that what you will. Now, there's a lot more to this, and there are a lot more files, there's a lot more evidence that is out there, there are a lot more people that have done a lot more research when it comes to Project Artichoke. A lot more people that were looking into MK Ultra found Artichoke and found the correlations, found findings, found victims that were again targeted when it came to MK Ultra. But then, in my understanding of how things developed, the one thing that I did not understand was the fact that the CIA clearly mentioned that they sought to establish control over what it perceived as the weaker and less intelligent segments of society. An open declaration that who are you aiming at when you're coming to develop something out of Artichoke? What is the end all be all goal? The end all be all goal, finding those lesser people, those less intelligent segments of society, ensuring that we target them first, figure out what works, what doesn't, and then weaponize it. Well, isn't that nice to hear? This was back in 52. What have they been up to since? What do they know now that they knew then? And how come? When there were a lot of committees formed after everything happened, when there were a lot of investigations going on, how come nothing came of it? How come we saw no consequences? Well, moving further, they also said that it is for potential agents, defectors, refugees, prisoners of war, and others. A CIA report also mentioned that if the hypnosis succeeded, assassins could be created to assassinate a prominent politician, the name of which was never really declared, but a politician nevertheless. Could this be limited to the United States? Could this be used as the primary source of overthrowing international governments, as the CIA had been infamous for decades on end? Being affiliated with overthrowing regimes, bringing in puppet governments, having vassal states. Was all of that the forte of the CIA? Yes. So was this the first bullet in their chamber a long time ago? Was this successful? Well, more questions than answers if you ask me. Because nothing concrete exists for us to jump to conclusions just yet. But the overseas operations took place in locations throughout Europe, Japan, Southeast Asia, and the Philippines, as was declared by the CIA report itself. So this is not something that has been taken out of context, been assumed, or is a conspiracy theory. It is widely accepted. Their area of operation, apart from the United States of America itself, Europe, Japan, Southeast Asia, Philippines. Look back at what happened in these particular regions. Look back at times wherein there were overthrowing of governments. Look back at times where things did not really add up, but there was no evidence present for people to be wondering otherwise. Teams were assembled to manage these operations, and they were told to conduct at the overseas bases operational experiments utilizing aliens as subjects. Now, a funny thing when it comes to Project Artichoke, they've literally mentioned the word aliens, but they do not mean extraterrestrials. They mean People that did not belong to the so-called territories that they were talking about, aliens that were invading those territories, today also known as migrants, people that traverse through extremes just to try and fend for a better life, maybe for themselves, maybe for their families back home, or maybe for their immediate families that they're traveling with. A lot can be said about what is currently going on when it comes to global migration patterns, where people are choosing to go, where people are being forced to go, and why. But where things got interesting was when investigations came into the mix. And that is where I'll jump to this document right here. Approved for release, as you see, which was once confidential. There's a lot in this document, but it's an 8-pager, and I'm going to try and get to those parts that are actually pretty interesting, if you would go to say. Now, these records, they were never revealed at the time of the investigations that were taking place. So the Rockefeller and congressional investigations that were taking place in 75-76, the CIA never put out these documents. And 18 cartons were immediately brought to the headquarters for review and a determination as to what, if any, records existed pertaining to Project Artichoke or Bluebird. Interesting, as these records had not previously been furnished to either the Rockefeller Commission or the congressional committees during the inquiries into the agency's research and experimentation with the drugs. So when the hammer was to come down, there was no evidence whatsoever. And yet later, voila, 18 documents appeared out of thin air. And here we go, back to square one. Another interesting part about these documents, it clearly states that approximately 14 linear feet of Project Artichoke material was contained within the 18 cartons retrieved from the archives. The remaining material in the cartons, however, does not pertain to these two projects or any other facets of the agency's research and experimentation with drugs. What does it pertain? Why was it that it was stored with one of the most heavily concealed experiments at the time? If you're gonna argue that they just threw in documents that had nothing to do with each other in the same boxes and they just happened to be there, I would say you're being hopeful. What did this material actually contain then? Well, the material that was contained within these cartons was not assembled in any particular fashion. So the task force that was reviewing all of this material when it finally came out decided to divide the documents into 7 basic categories. Here is where things get interesting. So the 7 basic categories, what did they entail? Background literature on behavioral control and drugs of interest to Project Bluebird or Artichoke, whatever you want to call it. That was the first category, which essentially contained scientific monographs, which essentially contained bibliographies, as in references documents, interrogations, interview techniques, lie detector results, hypnotism and brainwashing results, and folders on specific drugs and chemical agents that were, well, essentially used. What's more intense is that it also covered behavioral control schemes, which spoke about non-drug related fields of behavior control. Amnesia, ESP, electroshock therapy, prefrontal lobotomies, and schizophrenia. They were very well aware of what they were doing. They had some of the best scientists in the game, some of the best doctors in the game at the time, who were in charge of every single thing that was going on. And they just kept going. A very interesting point in the first subdivision was the fact that there were several US Army studies on psychological warfare at the time. A lot of drugs, but why? Why were drugs all of a sudden a point of interest? Well, it turns out that there were intelligence reports that were concerning foreign drug research, specifically in the Soviet army. So research such as the psychiatric research in Czechoslovakia was one of the highlighting factors as to why the CIA was so fascinated as to can it actually use psychoactive drugs and substances that alter human minds, alter human perceptions into molding better soldiers on the battlefield or better assassins that they could repurpose every single time they wanted by just essentially wiping the slate clean. Next came information related to the agency's drug testing, but more importantly, interrogation activities involving human beings. What's dreadful is the fact that the next 6 pages of this release, of these documents that had come out, were exempt from view, from public release. So the next 6 documents are all but gone. And when you scroll further, you come across a random line that starts with to 1946 with various drugs believed to aid in interrogation. Information relates to several experiments on approximately 88 witting American citizens using such drugs as benzodrine, caffeine, scopolamine, alcohol, and tetrahydrocannabidiol acetate. This memorandum also mentions an unwitting test in 1943 on a notorious New York gangster by one of the OSS researchers. Fascinating, dreadful, more questions than answers. Yes to all of the above, I would say. Freaky in some capacity, thought inducing in the others. Who was this New York gangster? Well, if you look it up at the time, a few names pop up. A few names that have been confirmed as well. Not important. What is important is the fact that they had American troops who apparently volunteered because they wanted to do right by their country and thought they were doing something that was gonna give their country the edge. Maybe they were not informed entirely as to what they were getting involved in. But exposing them to a bunch of psychoactive substances because they had previously been exposed to them, is that justification enough? I don't think so. Do you? The third section, hypnosis. The CIA itself admits that hypnosis was their core construct of Project Artichoke. They really wanted to break through and have a revelation in hypnosis and wanted to, by some capacity or the other, be able to weaponize it. But would they admit if they had a breakthrough, or would they cover it up by simply stating that it was, of course, by all means, it was an avenue of interest, extreme interest, but they had little to no results to show for it. No developments that they would label as breakthroughs. 51 to 54, a bunch of CIA agents were put under hypnosis in various capacities. Some successfully so, some not so much. When you think about hypnosis, you look back at, the earliest memories of most of us that are casual consumers of such content would be Captain America. You read the book and you turn into the Winter Soldier. You read the book again and you're wiped clean, ready for action. How much of that is based on actual reality? Can you read a set of words that can trigger hypnosis? Absolutely. Once under hypnosis, a person can be restored back to their proper cognitive function, and yet a single trigger can put them back in that state right away. Now You See Me is another movie that has depicted this in exceptionally, let's say, semi-positive avenues. And yet when you look at this from the aspect of, weaponization, turns grim real quick. There is a factor in hypnosis known as disguised induction of hypnosis. Essentially, people that are not expecting to get hypnotized, have been hypnotized before, have a pre-programmed trigger word in their brain, are going about their business on a regular, and all of a sudden they're hit with that trigger. and they are gone. Essentially, they exist and their brain is ready to be programmed into getting whatever you want to get done. There are ample YouTube videos out there that one can actually look at and wonder how valid are these so called claims. Pretty valid, maybe not so much. Bottom line being what? That is hypnosis real? Yes, it is. Can you weaponize it? Yeah, you can. Was it a breakthrough? According to the CIA, not really. But can you take their word for it? The fourth section included planning, administration, budget, and materials. What that essentially means is there is a black budget that exists, and the CIA, let's just say, has no worrying to do when it comes to getting funding. They have their own means, and the American black budget is deep enough. It was, ever since the, let's just say, military industrial complex existed. 52, they had enough money lying around that they never needed to disclose. Leave it to the CIA to go ahead and try and claim that, well, it doesn't really seem like MK Ultra's extravagant spending was the same thing when it came to its predecessor. And yet, when it comes to bookkeeping, who is to know how much was actually spent? Speculations galore, but what is the reality? You can't turn back time and find out whether there were success ratios that were, well, actually represented, whether MK Ultra was pushed forward because of the fact that they saw enough success in Project Artichoke. And if MK Ultra was a direct result of the findings that they actually came across when they first started off with acute drug testing, with acute drug exposure to so-called volunteers. The fifth segment was personnel, and here is where there is a shocking revelation. It clearly stated that it consisted of 2 boxes of personality files and individuals who were of interest to Project Bluebird or Artichoke, many of whom were later of extreme interest to Project MK Ultra. Also, there were a total of 357 folders in this collection. So as records go, 357 at least. Many other names of individuals of interest to Project Artichoke are contained in individual folders, as well as they've been appearing throughout the entire collection of the newly found material that was earlier nowhere to be found. Who were these people? Well, it consisted mainly of doctors, psychiatrists, chemists, hypnotists who were doing extreme work with the CIA, who were also acknowledged as experts in the areas of interest to Bluebird and later on to MK Ultra. Also, of course, US government agencies had their own people, and then there were those that were never mentioned. Off the books, off the records, only horror stories to describe what they went through at the time, and nothing to show for it. Sixth segment, interrogation literature, conveniently wiped clean. Seventh, miscellaneous, conveniently wiped clean again. But they do mention that they contained personal papers and letters for some of the agency employees connected to Project Artichoke. Personal papers and letters, testimonies, if you will, of what those people are going through, what those people went through at the time, what they were experiencing when they were not being monitored, what they were experiencing maybe after the fact. Stuff they wanted to get off their chest, maybe stuff they wanted the regular people to know about, stuff they wanted you and me to be aware of in the future, stuff maybe none of us will ever know. Finally, an assortment of 35mm film containing snapshots and microfilms of documents, which were essentially reports on the chemical, LSD, and psychological warfare findings. They appeared to be tourist type photographs and of no apparent significance in the term of artichoke techniques. So, if you were to ask me, hey man, fabricate a bunch of evidence that makes us look good, makes this project look like a waste of time, a waste of some amount of money, not substantial amount of money, with little to no findings that none of us could ever gain anything on, go ahead, do that. Essentially, what most of us would come up with is what was found in terms of what was on the film. A number of drugs and one injection device were also supposedly found from the archives. And on 22nd of August 1977, a representative of the agency's Office of Medical Service examined what was found. What was it? Well, it was an automatic self-injecting device, similar to the ones that are used by the military to inject themselves with adrenaline. The device and the design of it differed from the Army's model only in the trigger mechanism, which appeared to be cruder, way less reliable. Comments of the expert. Also, Raudixin, a 100 milligram tablet, described accurately as the whole root of the Raufolia serpentina. Comments? Well, it was an ethical medical preparation still used today to treat hypertension and psychotic states. What induced those psychotic states? What led to a person going to that level of psychosis that they had to receive medication to get them back? Thorazine hydrochloride, 1 ampule, 25 milligrams. Comments? Thorazine is commonly used tranquilizer. Psychosis to the point wherein people, well, in this case, as they would call them, subjects, had to be tranquilized, to be put down, so that they can be strapped up to the table and they will be pushed back into psychosis once again. Finally, Mirazine. 2 small green packets, 2 pills each, sealed in plastic. Comments of the expert? Mirazine is an anti-nausea medication. Sounds to me like the only point wherein this medication would be useful to the so-called subjects is after a prolonged period of exposure to intensive drugs. When they're finally starting to sober up, finally starting to gain control of their mind again, they're nauseated and they need something to stop that feeling. Daprosol. Comment? A mild analgesic containing a small amount of dexamphetamine. They found a sealed display card from the Columbia University Parkinson Research Lab showing the drugs listed below. All the drugs seem to have been used for the treatment of Parkinson's. And last but not the least, 2 drugs listed under the study as compound 08958 and MK02. These 2 compounds could not be identified. Professionals comment, there is no way of knowing what they contained without inquiring through the Parkinson Research Lab at Columbia University. It was my assumption that these were new drugs for the treatment of Parkinson's, which were under study at the lab in the 50s. 2 drugs listed as compound 08958 MK02. I'm sure it draws tangents for a lot of you that have been involved in the world of research and in the world of what exactly happened back then. And for those of us that are new, for those of us that are still wondering as to what these compounds were, why were there experimental drugs in the mix? Well, if you're someone who's hopeful, someone who's willing to side with the CIA, with their methods back in the day, one might be able to argue that it was purely research. Of course, experimental drugs were involved, it was research. Others might be scared. And that essentially paints a very grim picture of what Project Artichoke was all about. We're not done here. We're going to go through a long list of projects that were executed by the CIA in different tangents, in different capacities. And what's next is MK Ultra. I want to create an entire playlist. I want to go through a bunch of different projects so that we have before us a certain timeline that we can look back at once we're at the very end and try to figure out where things match up. What project and its findings, at least the ones that were disclosed to us, leads to where. And for those projects that were hush hush, that still are hush hush, well, maybe after we find out exactly the nature of all these other projects, maybe, just maybe, we'll be able to figure out what areas of interest does the CIA or, well, other global secretive organizations, what are their areas of interest? What do they really want to achieve if money was of no value and time was at their disposal, if there were no laws applicable and human life was disposable?